Hey Detoxers, welcome to a special episode of the Disinfo Detox. I am joined by Adam Swart, founder of Crowds on Demand, the original paid protesting firm. And today we're going to talk about paid protesting. Adam, welcome to the Disinfo Detox.
Hey, Nolan, thanks so much for having me on your program.
Yeah, I'm so glad your team reached out to me. And there's a lot I want to ask you about protesting in general, but paid protesting in particular. But before we do, can you tell us about Crowds on Demand? What is it, how to get started, and why is it called the original paid protesting firm?
Sure. Well, Crowds on Demand is the largest protest company in the country. We specialize in, executing protests, advocacy campaigns, PR stunts, even that are not political. We've been doing this for 13 years. I started when I was in college. And that's what we do. It's important. One of the reasons I do like to go on these podcasts is to emphasize there's a lot of misinformation about what we do, but that we do only legal, peaceful work, right? So obviously we can get into the ethics at some point later in the program because that's an important topic. But it's important to emphasize just from the outset that what we do is legal and peaceful because there's so much disinformation out there about what we do.
Yeah, well said. In this day and age, you have to make those qualifiers, unfortunately. Okay, so you've been around 13 years. Where'd you guys get started?
So we started in LA. So I was a college student at UCLA. Started the business. So it's kind of funny. So a couple things. I worked on a lot of campaigns, mostly on the Democratic side, but we're very much independents now. We work with Democrats, Republicans, whatever. Um, what's interesting is I got started seeing such a need for people to come out to these sorts of events because the people running these campaigns at the time were, of the 60s generation where they were used to being able to put some flyers on the quad and have thousands of people show up. And as the era changed, they were struggling to adapt to the idea of it being harder to draw out participants. So with that in mind, I got to thinking when I was in LA, okay, we have a lot of actors that are out of work, right? What if we put actors to work essentially filling the crowd? So that was kind of the initial premise of the business, not just political, but for audience events or whatever, right? But then that sort of morphed over time. We don't really do actors so much for political events because we've gotten bad press over it, like in the sense of the idea that we're just stacking the room with people who don't care about the issue. So now our bigger focus is having people who do care about the issue. We just essentially compensate them for showing up.
Okay, yeah, so just to be clear, right? Because that's one of the critiques, right? That all the protesters, whether it's a right protest or a left protest, they're all paid and they don't really care about the cause. But you're saying that uh, you disagree with that, right? So from your experience, the folks there care. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, okay. So I think you just have to unpack it because I think when people think paid protesting, it's like paid protesting bad, right? But when you actually think about it, okay, we're talking about a couple $100s of compensation, right? Are people really going to abandon their basic convictions for a couple $100? If you're a BLM activist, are you really going to go to a MAGA rally because somebody pays you a couple $100? I mean, it's actually sort of a demeaning and classist argument that people make. And a lot of the people who make that are actually like highly paid talk show hosts who are like, oh no, I'm totally genuine when I'm getting paid 7, 8 figures to express my views. Oh, those are sincere views. But when someone's getting paid $100 or $200, oh, that's a paid shill. So I find that actually like an incredibly classist argument.
Okay, and then let's talk about another one. There's the critique that paid protesters give the illusion of support, but really there's no support, and these things will fizzle out. So how do you respond to that?
Well, and that's actually the part that it would fizzle out if it doesn't actually end up catching on is true. And that's actually why what we do isn't manipulative. So if you think about a lot of the biggest movements in history were actually sort of manufactured, quote unquote, from the start, but then they caught on, right? You need what I call a catalyst. So paid protesting like advertising. Think about starting a company, right? You want to do advertising because why? Because you need people to know about your product. So a protest is in a sense an advertisement. right? So if you think about the Tea Party, right, this got started with, 50 people in the silly Revolutionary War outfits, right, in like 2009, 2010, right? But then it really caught on. Okay, they had a lot of funding. Conservative media really amplified it, but ultimately that caught on and it grew, right? Conversely, if you think about someone like Jeb Bush, who put a ton of money into his campaign, right? Like he raised like $200 million, and fundamentally he failed, right? The money buys attention, right? But it ultimately does not mean that the movement will catch on. So I think that's like sort of the misnomer. So I agree that a movement will fizzle if it doesn't catch on. What my goal is when we start these movements is to actually get people's attention and get people's interest. Because they're think about, I guess my other challenge to your listeners is think about all the amazing causes and amazing movements that are not well known because they just simply lack the money to be able to get off the ground.
So when we talk about, you know, spending money on paid protesters, obviously, that's got to be a costly endeavor for
Yeah.
some of these movements. How do you kind of balance that argument about with as far as how this relates to democracy? Does the money coming in mean that the interests of the wealthy are privileged over others?
Well, I think what I hear you saying, Nolan, is that money can buy you some degree of influence in the United States. Is that the point that you're making? I mean,
Well,
uh,
yeah, that's I mean, I think that's a question, right? Because most people don't have enough money to pay a firm to pay for protesters. So is this something that like only the wealthy can do? How do you respond to that?
well, okay, I actually would say that we're making it easier because what we for less established interests, right? So if you're like pharma, right, or you're big tech, you have had years and billions of dollars worth of lobbyists. You've basically written the law, your own regulations, right? So if you come in and say, okay, well, that the cost of that is billions of dollars, right? So it doesn't cost billions of dollars to hire our services, right? It might be in the tens of thousands, it might be in the hundreds of thousands, it might be in the millions, right? If you're talking about a massive, massive campaign. So, if anything, what we actually help some smaller or medium sized movements that lack the funding to be able to essentially fund an entire long term infrastructure to establish themselves to actually take on people who do have that established infrastructure. So again, not trying to say it's cheap and not trying to say like a working class person could just hire this, but it's actually much cheaper than the alternative strategy, which is hiring an army of lawyers, lobbyists, regulators, creating a revolving door of former congressmen and senators and generals, right? Like the Pentagon and the defense contractor industry. I mean, the cost of that is billions and billions of dollars, right? So I would actually argue that we help smaller causes, and we tend to be hired by sort of oppositional interests, right? So if you're Google, you're not going to hire like Google is not going to hire us necessarily because Google doesn't need us. It's a competitor who's trying to take on Google who's going to hire us, right? So I would argue that we're really not so much used by established interests and we tend to be used by more of the competitors because essentially paying protesters is an inherently oppositional strategy.
Okay, and another critique I've heard of paid protester firms is that you guys have no principles, no morals, no ethical compass. You just go where the money is. How do you respond to those kind of critiques?
Well, that's not true in our case. In fact, we regularly reject um, engagements that don't comport with our values. Now, that doesn't mean Adam Swart has to agree with you 100%. I don't, right? It has to be in what's called the Overton window. Now, you're obviously an academic, so you know what that is. But for your listeners, the Overton window, and obviously that's subjective, is within the acceptable range of discourse, right? So, I one really good example of this is the cryptocurrency industry, right? So when the cryptocurrency folks started hiring us maybe about 7 or 8 years ago, and we've done a lot of engagement since. I was I was not 100% on board with cryptocurrency, but I felt that at the time, especially now, obviously they have a lot more advocates, but at the time they were the banks and the big institutions essentially were regulating them out of business, and they weren't even being able to speak, right? So we are essentially giving voice to people, and making sure they're able to express themselves, right? So I don't have to agree with it 100% in order to take on the cause. But with all of that said, there are certain things that we kind of regularly reject, which is obviously anything that won't be like peaceful or law abiding, but also anything that I think is going to put our folks in too much risk. So if you're putting, there's a protest where you're going to have like Proud Boys versus Antifa, right? Like I don't want my people in the middle of that, right? Because that's a lot of kind of aggressive energy that doesn't help. And then the other thing is I don't like to add to the noise. I'm in the business of persuasion, right? I liken
Mm.
myself more to an advertising firm than I do to like some sort of dirty trickster, right? Like I want to help evangelize movements and companies and everything. So I don't like to just be part of the noise. Like this Israel Palestine, for example, we've kind of rejected a lot. They are not the, we wouldn't get involved in a broader issue, but the problem is that it's just the noise, right? You're not convincing everybody. You're just trying to scream at this person louder than they can scream at you. And I find that that's not really what I want to be engaged in.
So, yeah, and a moment ago you talked about how, basically there's these large, like wealthy and powerful interests who have the money and influence, and folks for a much lower price can come to you to try and combat them. In a closely related kind of question, and I know you probably can't answer this directly, but just sort of through
Mhm.
your expertise, when you look at like the protests going on across the United States, say in the last handful of years, do you think how much of that do you think is paid protesters? Like, what role do you think your industry plays in the protests today? Is it a small role, large role? What do you think?
Well, I mean, I have a controversial take, which is that everything is paid. So, there's paid directly and there's paid indirectly. So for example, labor unions, right? If you're in a labor union, anyone who's in a union knows you're expected to go to certain political events for whoever the union endorses, right? And if you go to these events regularly, you're going to find yourself kind of getting good shifts, getting kind of favorable treatment, and vice versa, right? I was just talking to a firefighter who was telling me exactly that the union supported someone that this person didn't support, and they basically were like, I'm screwed. I have to go to this rally for someone I don't support or risk kind of reprisals, right? Half the protests you see in DC are like Capitol Hill staff. There are 15,000 Capitol Hill staff on the both sides, Republican and Democrat, right? So when you see like hundreds of people in the background of those press conferences, you realize those are just the people who work for those congressmen and senators, right? Who are expected to go out there, right? You know, Obviously there's the working down. I mean, there's like the Instagram thing where people are flexing, right? I mean, when you had the Real Housewives of Orange County out at the Black Lives Matter protests, I mean, do you think that they understand institutional racism, or do you think they're trying to flex for likes on social media, right? Like, let's be real. So I guess my point being is that if you really break it down, all sort of protest is paid in one way or another. Again, that doesn't mean, I think people take that as, oh, Adam, you're saying there isn't such thing as legitimate protest. No, I think people have a right to express their opinions, and people have right to have some degree of ulterior motivations other than sincere views to express their opinion. So I'm not saying any of those people like don't agree with it. If you're a Republican political staffer, you probably do agree with whatever some Republic Ted Cruz is saying, and you're in the background of his press conference. But you're there because you're paid to be there, right? You're not there because like you care that much about what Ted Cruz is saying. So I guess that's my point. So if you really unpack it, there is no such thing as like truly unpaid activism.
It could be that we've already talked about it, but what is sort of one of the biggest things you want people to know about your company and your industry that maybe the media gets wrong about it?
I think the biggest thing that they get wrong is the concept that a protest is, they believe a protest is a plebiscite, not a poll, not a form of attention grabbing, right? So when they see, and when dumb politicians see 300 people on one side of an issue and 50 people on the other side of the issue, the idea is a lot of the dumb ones are like, oh, well, they're 6-1 in favor of that. When really a protest is a mechanism for generating attention. So I think it's a big piece of misinformation, the idea that a protest is somehow indicative of the broader sentiment, right? You can have um 60%, 70% of people on board with one thing, and those 70% are never protesting, and actually the other side are. And in fact, to piggyback on that, Nolan, one of the other misnomers is that we kind of push minority viewpoints through against the will of the majority, when in fact, we're actually more often advocating for the will of the silent majority, right? On these 80-20 issues where you have 20% who are just really loud and obnoxious, and they attend every city council meeting, every board meeting, whatever, right? And the 80%, they have jobs, they have families, right? So they're not doing that. Well, as a result of all of this, the 80% often needs to hire us to turn people out for them. So, because the other side, they don't have jobs, right? Maybe they're like, they have no other competing force on their time. So that really helps us in regards to, that's the kind of business we do a lot.
Yeah, and I want to just drill down on one thing you said there, because I think you're right, and I think that's often lost. That one of the important factors to protest is it draws attention to movements, policies, societal inequities, whatever it may be. But there's also a component of it too, right? Protests are also a way about putting fear into those in power, right? Like I remember LBJ
Yeah.
famously, was looking out the White House window and looking at those protesters and said, like, I don't know if we send more troops to Vietnam, I don't know if I'm going to be able to control the country domestically. There was a fear that this policy would harm the nation. So can you just speak to that? Because you said attention, but attention's part of it, right? But you also want to pressure those in power through effective protest, right?
I think that's true. I think that's true, and that's a good example. But in order to get to that point, you have to really have a critical mass. So 20 people isn't going to do it. You have to show the key for that, and that's actually one of the major stumbling blocks of the anti-Trump movement. Is it's the same people who come out every single week, the people who are going to oppose Trump no matter what, right? Where LBJ was referring to was the fact that many of the someone was telling me, Mr. America, right? Like your average center person, right, was turning against Vietnam, right? And that same person who 10 years ago would have been saying, oh, well, if our country says to do it, our leaders say to do it, it's right. Like they trust our leaders. And then that trust was collapsing, right? So I think when you start losing that center person, right, that's when policy changes. So if you think about the genius of the MLK civil rights movement was through the horrific videos of the protesters being attacked by the sort of racist Southern law enforcement, right? Ordinary Americans who may not have known much about civil rights could see that and say, okay, this is wrong no matter where you stand, right? So I think that protest, when it reaches a critical mass, but it has to reach not just a numbers mass, it has to reach the kind of people who are in the middle of the political divide. And it's an important tool, but it's very hard to do that because people in the middle of the political divide are sort of naturally apolitical, or at least moderate, and these are people who probably don't turn out to a lot of protests.
Good call. Hey, Adam, fascinating stuff. Where can folks follow your work and get a hold of Crowds on Demand?
Sure, crowdsondemand.com or on X at CEO Adam Swart.
Adam Swart, thank you so much for being on the Disinfo Detox, man. It's been awesome.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
All right. Thank you, Detoxers. We'll see you next time.